Today I want to talk about, let's talk about Jesus. Yeah? And maybe we'll talk about the end of the world, but which end? An apt question, because what we've been taught isn't necessarily what the reality of things. But let's talk about Jesus. So, we've been talking about Christology, we've been talking about the atonement, we've been talking about the covenants. Pop quiz. How many major covenants are in the canon of Scripture? 5. The Noahic, Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic, and the new, the better covenant. Excellent. Gold star. So, what was on my heart to talk about was an aspect of what I believe to be the gospel story that, not what I believe to be the gospel story. I want to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. as a necessary component of the gospel story that I believe is as essential as the resurrection or the ascension. Because Jesus took great pains to talk about a forthcoming destruction and an end of the age and all of these things. And this week I was thinking about it, and it just kind of dawned on me. Throughout all of the Old Testament, the main way that God communicated with his people was through what? The prophets. The prophets, what did they communicate, typically? Change your ways. What else? Upcoming events, droughts, dooms, destructions. It was invasions. It was the one person that the entire nation trusted to speak the words of God to the nation as they were being heard. That's how it was. That's how it was under the old covenant. So when we think about the prophets, how many know that the Bible is not ordered chronologically? Yeah, it's not ordered chronologically. It's ordered by genre, and the last part of the Old Testament is what we call the prophets, major and minor. Now that doesn't mean important and unimportant. It means long to short. So that's part of why, just reading through the Bible straight through can be so confusing, is because you could start towards the end of the book and be 800 years before Jesus. It can be really confusing to follow a consistent chronological story. Anybody out there who can put together a chronological Bible, please do it because I want it. I got one. So, John the Baptist gets talked of as a prophet in the New Testament, right? The last prophet that we know of. His job was to proclaim the coming of the Son of David, the fulfillment of the Davidic promises, the Abrahamic promises, and all this. I would also like to kind of posit the possibility that Jesus, in his function as king and in his function as high priest, also functioned as the final word, the finality of the prophets. Not only was he the mouthpiece of God, he was God. He was the ultimate prophet. Can we see that, right? He's the fulfillment, the culmination of it all. Every convention of the Old Covenant, the high priest, the scapegoat, the prophets, the priests, all of that, all those conventions squeezed into one person who functioned as them all. So Jesus was king, priest, Messiah, but he was also prophet, the final word of the Lord from the basis of operating within the system of the Old Covenant. So I just realized I left my Bible at home. What a goof.
That's okay. It's all good.
Can I borrow someone's Bible?
Will that one work?
Sure. What one?
Morgan's work?
Yeah, it'll work just fine. Let's open up to Matthew 23. Go for the pen and drop the tablet. Look at me go!
I don't feel so bad about leaving my notes at home.
Matthew 23. Perfect. So, to talk about prophets again for a second, and how this relates to these scriptures, the prophets got the words of the Lord. They got visions about coming destructions. We think about Daniel. We think about Ezekiel. We think about Isaiah. And the point was, these people, the Israelites, were being unfaithful covenant partners and sometimes doing heinously evil things. And God is like, hey, Ezekiel, the people are doing really wacky, heinous things, and they need to stop because that is going to incur covenant curses. And I have to be a faithful God in the covenant that I'm in and be, your covenant partner and your benefactor, but because your covenant is with me, I also have to be the covenant punisher. And if the people don't turn away from what they're doing, this is what that covenant punishment is going to look like. And here is exactly how the people can avoid it. He's extremely clear and in no uncertain terms. He lays out like, hey, this is what's going on. If the people don't turn from this, this is what's going to happen. So I want to bring in this context of prophetic proclaiming into Matthew 23. So we'll start with verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "Scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fingers long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across the sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Oh, Jesus, big mad. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it's nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And he continues to pronounce these woes over the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day. So let's jump down to verse 29. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, ye hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding the blood of the prophets. Stop. Yeah. We just got a very important piece of information. There was a modern, at the time, air and attitude of superiority to those who came before the scribes and Pharisees, who did what? Killed the prophets. If we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents. You brood of vipers, how are you going to escape being sentenced to, in English we translate it as hell, but the word here is Gehenna. Therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that, and pay attention, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Can't tell you how many times I glossed over that, thinking that Jesus was just big mad at these people and was kind of like loosely damning them, loosely condemning them from, like about the way that they were living and calling them to change. No, he is making a serious proclamation. Amen. He's making a serious, not benediction, proclamation, declaration, yeah. That so on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So, Jesus is saying that all of the righteous blood of the prophets and the blood of the righteous that was spilled by the people, not just the people who gone before, but this generation, all that blood is going to be on their heads and on their hands. Weird thing to say. What does that mean? Well, let's keep going. So you may have a kind of a subheader here, Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now we're going to go over to Matthew 24, and we're going to stop for a second. How many of us have been taught that Matthew 24 is a chapter that is about the end of the world? I've been taught that. So hey, that's great. So we're starting with primarily a clean slate here, because Jesus goes on. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So he just told his disciples, you see all these buildings? Every one of them is going to get wrecked. It's going to be a pile of rubble. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us then, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" They ask him 3 questions. Now, I had always been taught that, what will be the sign of your coming and what will be the sign of the end of the age? That was like a futuristic question, like, how's the world going to end? The end of the world was not something that was in first century Hebraic thought. Our modernistic ideas of the world blowing itself up or being burned away in fire, and an entire third of the oceans turning to blood, and a third of the earth being scorched, and the billions upon billions of people being killed by these plagues that we see in Revelation, that's a wholly modern invention. Wholly modern. And I want to peel back to these questions, because we can see what the disciples think at this point by the questions that they ask. And they ask them in conjunction. Tell us then, when will these things be? So when are these things going to happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So the disciples understand these 3 things to be in conjunction. That when Jesus returns, what he said is going to be fulfilled, and it will signal the end of the age. What age? First century Christendom and Hebraic thought of the world in 2 ages. The temple age and the post-temple age, right? If I'm remembering my terms, Marcus.
The microphone's right there with Marcus.
Oh, he's got it, okay.
Actually, is this up? Actually, it was 3 ages: the pre-temple age,
That's right.
the temple age, and then the post-temple age.
Mm-hmm. So, they believed that they were in the temple age because they still had a temple. But that's the temple as a whole rabbit trail we'll kind of leave for now. So, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Jesus had just pronounced that the blood of the righteous is going to come on this generation. And he just pronounced that no stone will be left on top of one another. So there's going to be a culmination of the blood of the prophets coming on this generation and a physical destruction of Jerusalem, right? So when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Jesus then answers these questions. See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Stop. Why is that important? Marcus?
Because they happen to be in the midst of what is the Roman peace, which extended for half a century, Pax Romana, and in that time, Rome put down wars almost before they began, so that most people living in that era had no experience of widespread war of any kind.
Exactly. This is occurring in the midst of the Pax Romana, where Marcus is absolutely right. War pretty much didn't happen. And if there were even whispers, or if home base in Rome heard that there was any sort of dissent, it was peace through enforcement. And, I mean, it wasn't like true, peace and harmony, but it was absence of conflict. So that's why that's very important. There will be, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Stop. Josephus, a Jewish historian, chronicles the fact that in the period between 30 AD and 70 AD, there was serious famine and serious earthquakes. Upwards of like magnitude 9.5. Like heavy duty earthquakes. Also, really quick, let's talk about what a generation means. Anyone want to define a generation for me? Some people say 40 years. Anyone else? Go ahead.
We've got in the Bible a couple of different generations. Prior to the Mosaic Covenant, the generation was defined as the lifespan from father being in charge of a family till the son took over at the father's death, and that could be anything from 20 to 100 years. However, after the Mosaic Covenant, we then began to use the 40-year term because of the fact that they wandered for 40 years in the desert, and they were told that it was to eliminate that entire unbelieving generation.
Exactly. So, Jesus is a Jew underneath the Mosaic Covenant system. And he uses the word generation to define untold thousands of years. No. See, I believe that when Jesus says, this generation will not pass away until these things come to pass. The blood of the prophets will be on this generation. He is speaking within the confines of what would colloquially be defined as a generation. It would be really strange and confusing for him to say, this generation will not pass away until they see my coming. This generation will not pass away until yada, yada, yada. and for him to mean, just thousands and thousands of years.
That's right.
It doesn't make linguistic sense. It doesn't make historical sense. And we can and have, I believe, over-spiritualized and decontextualized a lot of language in Scripture and how it's used to describe what it's describing. So, with that in mind, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of these are but the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So, we have a few words to describe the whole world. We have one word that describes the immediate known inhabited land. We have all peoples across the globe, and then we have all the earth encompassed in existence. I can't remember the first two, but the final word is cosmos.
Yes.
It is not cosmos, and it is not this word, it is this word. Which doesn't exactly translate super well into English. At least ways not in this translation or in most translations that I've read. But that is the idea. The known inhabited immediate region. So, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stop. We see Jesus making a reference to the prophet Daniel, who had many escapades and adventures, not least of which was his proclamation of a coming destruction of Jerusalem. And we see here, let the reader understand. So, who would be the reader? Does let the reader understand mean all peoples for all time into the future, let all readers understand forever?
No. It means those of the immediate first century following Christ.
Right. It would be those who are reading this in its most immediate context. So we have to be thinking, what is a first century Jewish or Gentile Christian supposed to understand about what he's reading? At this point, that's the most important thing for us to get. Not how do these proclamations of destruction apply to nations in modernity, and how is God going to judge our nation? Like, no, God doesn't judge nations anymore.
Right.
He's not in covenant with them.
Right.
The only covenant that he is upholding and honoring is the covenant that he has with his son,
Yeah. Amen.
that we are included in
Hallelujah.
as humanity. Now we see some really interesting details. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, so we're referencing the temple, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And let the one who is on the housetop not go down and take what's in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and will never be. Why on earth would Jesus be praying that this coming tribulation, this coming destruction, not be in the winter or on a Sabbath? That would be fairly irrelevant if it was a completely inescapable future event that is going to affect all of humanity. Who cares if it's in winter? Everyone's going to die, right? At least that's what I was taught. And yet Jesus makes a point to say, let's hope that this isn't winter or on a Sabbath. And we're going to come back around to these details. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, don't believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand, so if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, don't go out. And if they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give forth its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Wild. We just got a bunch of weird apocalyptic, major destruction. Sounds like existence is going to get blown up. Sounds like we're going to get all this wild stuff. And yet, Jesus says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Now, because we are so far from this, from the relevancy of what this would mean to a person hearing it at the time, we take these things and cast them into the future. We say, we even take this, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away, is the verse immediately following that, or the rest of the phrase of that. So we think that there's this kind of eternality to this proclamation of destruction. We think that there is this finality of existence with this proclamation, with this prophecy coming from the words of God as high priest, king, and prophet. Well, we see stuff like this throughout the Old Testament. We see, the rivers will turn to blood, the skies will be darkened, the moon will not give forth its light. We see language like this in other places in the Old Testament, and we don't think of that as being some sort of strange futuristic event that's going to be world-shaking. We think of it as, that pointed to the Babylonian capturing and destruction of Jerusalem in the 586. Because we see these really distinct corollary one-to-ones between lines of prophecy and historical events that read its mail. So, I want to talk about this phrase, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Remember when we talked about idioms? I already see you jumping. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I remember you specifically referring to the phrase of heaven and earth back at that time referred to the temple and the court.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Gold star. Right on the dome. So Jesus goes on and answers, when? When will this happen? But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Now, we also got a really clear delineation. This generation will not pass away before these things happen. So, the blood of the prophets is going to come on this generation. The city's going to be destroyed. And it's going to happen to this generation. But I don't even know when exactly that's going to happen. Only the Father does. So we have a pretty clear a pretty clear expectation laid out that this is an incipient event. But the day and the hour is not concrete. So be watchful. That's where we see a lot of the warnings about being watchful about the coming destruction. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, and one left. Stop. Marcus, you want to elucidate that?
Within the books of Josephus, he talks about the wars of the Jews. And within that particular book, he talks about the battles that took place between the Romans and the Jews. And specifically, the Jews were acting as guerrilla warfare members, whereas the Romans were fighting in a very formal fashion. And the Romans normally were very, very disciplined in what they did. However, on their journey to Jerusalem, because of the guerrilla style of warfare that the Jews had been waging, occasionally, while marching in ranks, the one Roman soldier or another would be going past a field with people working in them, and they would be so incensed at the warfare that the Jews were waging that they would race out into the field and they would kill one person, just one, and leave another one still working and race back and get back into ranks. And Josephus delineates that very clearly in his story, in his Wars of the Jews.
Exactly. That's a huge element. Another part that I believe pertains to that as well is the way by which in 70 AD, when the Roman army siege finally broke into the city, well, they found a ghastly horror show because there was disease, there was famine because they had burned their own grain stores. To prove that God was going to deliver them from this siege at the hands of the Romans, that the Messiah was going to come and was going to deliver them, and one crazed fanatic burned all of their grain stores destroyed their food supply. People began dying in the streets. People began rotting in the streets because they did not have access to Gehenna, which was a giant, ever-burning trash pit, how the city disposed of its waste. And they did not like to have to throw bodies into Gehenna because the Jews are very particular about their death rites and burial and the ossuaries. Your bone boxes. You'd be buried in one tomb until you rotted away, and then you get your bones put into a bone box, and then you get put with the bones of your fathers. The Romans come in and see this squalor, the harrowing picture of death and destruction, and they begin indiscriminately killing about half of the population, because Rome likes two things: taxes and slaves. So we do see kind of around a 50-50, if I'm remembering correctly, a 50-50 indiscrimination of who's being killed and who's being captured. So let's continue on. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them food at their proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces, put him with the hypocrites, and in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. How many people have been taught that the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth is eternal conscious torment in hell? I should see a lot of hands, because that's the primary teaching of evangelical Christianity in the West. We see that sort of imagery all throughout the Old Testament with no real connotations of eternality with it. We see this is something that is a destination for that denotes, suffering, weeping, and gnashing of teeth. But at every point that Jerusalem has been sieged, destroyed, or the Israelites been captured, they've had to use Gehenna to burn the bodies. They had to literally use the actual already established sanitation pit where refuse was burned to burn all those corpses as quickly as possible, because if they took the time to bury them all, people would start catching diseases. So when you're dealing with death on this kind of scale, you have to get rid of your dead. And where do you do it? Where there is already fire. So, popping through these and kind of bringing about some context that I didn't even really have until a few years ago. That's corroborated by Josephus. I'd love to hear some thoughts around the room as to does this bring up any questions? Does this bring up any thoughts, comments? Keith?
Microphone.
Well, a thought and a comment is that what we tend to do in the modernity is the word, is we tend to make it about us so that we can be in the story, so that we can do that. And so I feel like that's what's happened over these last couple generations. Actually, 1830 is when Darby came up with a lot of the stuff that we're taught now. And so since then, we've made it about us, and that's what's kind of twisted the whole prophetic thought on these scriptures.
Agreed. It's pretty amazing and, to me, empowering to look back at, because it's really funny, like going back to the end of Matthew 23. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often I would have gathered you, yada, yada, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And then immediately, we see a chapter break, and in our modern brains, we think, okay, this is now something else is going on. But chapter breaks weren't originally there. These were just like a really long continuation of text. Jesus left the temple, was going away, and his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, but he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." When we're kind of primed and conditioned to look at texts with a preconceived context in mind, we can just kind of skim over those things and think, oh, yeah, no, he's talking about the end of the world. Maybe that's a colloquialism for, just everything being destroyed. Because I've been taught so much that this passage is about the end of the world. It's like, well, you could look at it that way, but I think that is a gross misrepresentation of what is actually being conveyed. We're seeing a prophetic declaration of what's coming as a consequence of those past. And, Jesus laments. It's like, I would have wrapped my arms around you like a mother hen over her brood. And yet, the entirety of the religious establishment wholesale rejected him, rejected his words, rejected his message. Everything that they had been looking forward to was culminating in the person of Christ. And the religious leaders were honestly really over being in this tenuous relationship with Rome, being a vassal people to Rome, vassal to God, vassal to Rome. We're sick of being vassals. We want to be on top. Yeah. And so that's what they felt like that was the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies is now we get to be the big boys on the block. Now we get to wreck everybody who's been wrecking us for the last 1,400 years. Got a comment, Marcus?
Well, part of that.
Turn it on.
We good? Part of that mindset came out of the prophecies and the fact that Daniel had actually prophesied that there was going to be a king arising out of the Jews, and Daniel gave a timeline, and they knew they were reaching that culmination of Daniel's timeline, and in their minds, the timeline meant a king for us. Therefore, we, the Jews, would have that ascendancy that you're talking about. And that was part of their religious culture.
Exactly. Exactly. Speaking of timelines, consider the span of time that separates the end of the life and ministry of Christ and his ascension and the destruction of Jerusalem. 40 years. I don't think that that's particularly a coincidence. I think that that's fulfillment. And I think that it coincides with Jesus' proclamations that this generation will not pass away until they see all these things come to pass. So talking about that, we don't have a ton of time to really dive into it like super at length. I could go on for hours about this. There is so much to the history. There is so much to the dating of the book of Revelation being penned pre-70 AD. It's hotly debated. It's by no means a settled debate, but I think there's very compelling evidence that the book of Revelation was penned pre-70 AD. And that kind of, when you look at the correlations between the visions that John has and all of this imagery of, beasts with 10 horns and 7 heads, yada, yada, we see a lot of these correlations between previous prophecies that spoke destruction over Jerusalem. And so I hold a view that Revelation is John's vision about the coming destruction. And there's tons of elements in there, like 144,000 will be saved. Entire churches have been made on that verse. Only 144,000 will be saved. Well, your odds aren't good. 144,000 to a first century Jew would mean a people in its totality.
Yes, that's right.
It would mean all of the people.
That's right.
So what happens in this imagery? Well, they're all sealed, given the seal of God by this angel, and they all escape this destruction. What's interesting about what happened in 70 AD, so as the Roman army is advancing, and they're carrying their banners and standards of war, all of the Christians, all the city sees this. The Christians, whoa, okay, this is important. They get out of Dodge.
That's right. They did.
All of them.
That's right. Every last one.
Josephus corroborates that. Every single Christian fled where? To the mountains of Judea.
Yep. Yeah.
And they escaped not just the siege, which lasted, 9.5 months? 7.5 months? Which, believe me, Rome could have sieged them for longer. But if Jerusalem hadn't shot themselves in the foot and burned their grain stores, among other things. Infighting, yep. All the Christians escaped. So, but the interesting thing was, as the Roman army was advancing, they get like a quarter mile away from the wall, they stop. And the field commander issues a tactical retreat. He says, fall back. And so they fall back. And that was the Christians' window. They all got out of Dodge at that moment. So, not to belabor the point, but I think that there is incredibly compelling evidence to correlate the imagery of the books of Revelation. These passages that we have been taught are about the end of the world, that if we really examine them and just examine the language within it, take away our modern insertions of meaning into the text, and look at what would have been relevant to the reader and then the subsequent events in history afterwards and how they unfolded, I'm pretty convinced that Jesus spoke a lot less about the end of the world than we think he did. And it sure as hell doesn't look like hell on earth.
Brandon?
Yes,
But it does look like hell in Jerusalem.
does look like hell in Jerusalem.
Okay, you say you don't want to belabor the point, and I agree that we could go on for hours and hours. But one of the things that we're often told is that we don't have any eyewitness accounts of that first century. But that's not true. We have Josephus and his writings, and Josephus did give eyewitness accounts that are considered to be accurate not only in his time, but in the immediate years following by the world's greatest historians of that time. And those eyewitness accounts, in them can be found nearly every single point that Jesus raises in Matthew 23 and 24, and nearly every single point. And I think if you look deep enough, you can find every single point in Revelation as well.
It's really hard to overstate that fact. It's really, really hard to overstate the stark connection and one-to-one relations between Josephus's writings and the imagery and prophetic proclamations of Jesus. Yes, Patty?
Can you explain the coming of the Son of Man?
Yeah. The coming of the Son of Man. So, like most things, it's hotly debated, but when Jesus says, you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds, we typically think of that as a good thing. It's like, oh, Jesus comes down, he's riding on a cloud, and he's coming in glory and majesty, and it looks really great and pretty, and everybody's excited about it. Coming on the clouds was a bad thing. It was a really bad thing. We see that throughout the Old Testament with the Lord coming on the clouds with his bow in his hand, stretched at the face of our enemies, yada, yada. It is almost always in conjunction with destruction and coming in wrath and judgment. And remember, what incites God's wrath is the law. Wrath came by the law. Paul's really explicit about that. So when God moved in judgment as a faithful covenantal partner to Israel's enemies, he was coming on the clouds in judgment. He was coming on the clouds in retribution and destruction. And we hate to see God in that picture, But we have to understand that God's actions were constrained by the covenant that he was in. And by the really garbage position that Israel put him in with wanting to cut a covenant with him, where he is the covenant benefactor, partner, and covenant punisher, enforcer of the law. And God, I'm glad God got tired of that. Well, he was tired of it to begin with. So does that kind of elucidate that a little better?
You said that it was a critical part of Jesus' death and ascension.
Right. So I believe that including the destruction of Jerusalem as part of the gospel story as essential is because it is the full eradication of all of the conventions of the old covenant. Amen. The temple was destroyed. The genealogies of the Aaronic priesthood were burned. Yes. They didn't even have the original Ark of the Covenant. That got taken in 586. Right. It's all gone. So it was the full obliteration of any way of legitimately being able to operate in the Mosaic covenant. You had it was essential to have the conventions of lineal sons of Aaron be the priesthood, have the actual temple where it was in Jerusalem. All of it got destroyed. So that element is essential to the gospel narrative because there is no turning back. There is no turning back to a system of law. It's not just undesirable, it's literally impossible. And yeah, try and breed a red heifer and build a new temple all you want. You will never be able to operate under the true conventions of the Mosaic covenant and priesthood. Thank God. Because it is gone. It is completely gone. And God cannot possibly relate to humanity through those conventions anymore. If you choose to do that because that's kind of where you're at, then God in his grace and mercy will meet you within your paradigm, as he has to do for all of us, as he brings us to greater levels of greater glory and revelation of the sons of God in us. But by God, he doesn't want us to stay there. He doesn't want us to stay in a relationship defined by performance and external conventions when he talks so much about the circumcision of the heart, replacing the people's heart of stone for a heart of flesh. That is forward covenantal language from the Old Testament about the new covenant. And next time we're going to talk about what is the New Jerusalem, because that's kind of neat. Marcus.
So you talked about the temple was destroyed, and all the genealogies were destroyed. Also, all of the priests were killed. And by the way, when we go back to Matthew 23, and Jesus says in verse 35, "Upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." Guess where the majority of the priests were killed? It
Right
is
there.
identified as the location within Josephus.
So we see these one-to-one fulfillments of so many of these passages in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And another main reason why that is so incredibly important is because if we see these things as future events, we live in fear, and that fear paralyzes us from making movements, as opposed to engaging in the ever-expanding, ever-advancing, unshakable kingdom of God, living from being more than conquerors, living from being seated in heavenly places, living from being citizens of the New Jerusalem, living from being grafted in to the spiritual Israel that that Paul talks about, that is not contingent upon your ethnicity or your patrilineage or anything like that. It is about humanity's involvement in the vicarious incarnation of Christ and the ultimate cleansing of humanity from sin and being able to live as new creations never seen before on the earth. Yes.
Plug Raptureless if you could. There's a free version.
Yes. Yes. So if you're at all interested, actually, I'll give you one piece of information that's in conjunction with that I could not unhear. And you won't be able to unhear it either.
Come on.
So Emperor Nero was a savage individual. He was the emperor, the Caesar of Rome for a short time. What's that?
Yeah, there are kids here.
That's okay. I'll speak in euphemisms then. Savage and psychotic. One of the things that he did was Marcus, was it in Rome or Jerusalem where he set up the bronze statue? I think it was a fairly common practice in the Roman occupation. There was a giant bronze statue of Caesar at the entrance to the marketplace. And you had to pass Roman guard in order to get into the marketplace. And what you had to do was pay a pittance, take some incense, and put it into a large bronze bowl that had ashes, incense burning at all hours of the day. You had to proclaim that Caesar is Lord, that Caesar is God, and you had to take some of the ashes and put it on the back of your hand or on your forehead. And they called that taking the mark.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. Come on.
Big whoa, right?
Yeah.
Nero, who was emperor at this time, garnered himself a reputation as such that he was referred to as a beast. Whenever Nero was mentioned, it was usually, oh yeah, the beast is angry today. The beast made a proclamation. The beast did this, the beast did that. I think that those are two fairly compelling bits of information to go side by side. So if Nero was Caesar at the time, guess whose statue would be there? And whose mark would you be taking? Mark of the beast. Go ahead, Marcus.
Most of you
plug Raptureless.
Most of you probably have a little bit of understanding of Hebrew, the language, and the fact that not only is it phonetic, not only is it
Pictographic.
but it's also numeric. And Nero's name could be spelled two different ways. And when you added up the letters of his name, either spelling added to the number 666. Therefore, the number of the beast was 666. And it was a way for the Jews to identify Nero without saying Nero, so that they didn't necessarily get thrown in jail, killed, just for saying that.
For propagating literature that defied the throne, that defied the God of the occupying army in your city. Talk in code. It's not some sort of secret mystical thing. It's literally how you avoided going to prison and being tortured if you got stopped by Roman guards and you had a copy of Revelation with you. So anyway, Jonathan Welton has a free version of the book Raptureless on his website. It's the first edition, and it's great. I got 2 chapters in. I'm like, I'm springing the $60 for the hard copy, or for the e-copy, because it's marvelous. It's marvelous, and to me, it was beyond compelling. And so, do yourself a favor, pick that up, read into it a little bit if you're interested. There's also the auspiciously named Understanding the Whole Bible by Jonathan Welton, or ambitiously named, but it does not fail to deliver. So, Father, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for good food. We thank you that you keep proving yourself to be good and gooder and gooderer and gooderer. So we thank you for the awesome food that we get to share together and enjoy your presence and enjoy one another. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah.